The Landlord's Rules. Mr. Gregory Harris stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his sleek, modern office, his sharp gaze cutting through the view of the suburban neighborhood below. The meticulously landscaped lawns and rows of elegant homes were a testament to his hard work, a testament to his unyielding drive. His community, Harris Estates, was more than just a neighborhood. It was a symbol of success. He had transformed barren land into a sought-after sanctuary for the city's upper class, a place where prestige and exclusivity flourished. He adjusted his tie, his fingers grazing over the fine silk fabric before settling on his desk, the polished mahogany surface gleaming in the soft light of the room. It was all a result of his ambition and vision, carefully crafted over decades. Mr. Harris had always prided himself on maintaining high standards, especially when it came to his rental policies. In his mind, these policies were not just rules. They were the very foundation that had made his properties so desirable. Exclusivity is everything, he muttered to himself, as if trying to reassure himself of his stance. His eyes roved across the room, landing on a large framed photograph of the first building he had ever bought, a modest brick structure in a rundown part of town. That was years ago. Since then, he had expanded exponentially, adding more buildings, more communities, each one more upscale than the last. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he ran a hand over the frame. "I've come a long way," he whispered, a sense of pride swelling within him. That building had been a stepping stone, the beginning of something much larger. Now he was one of the most well-known property owners in the city, his name synonymous with wealth and status. His gaze shifted to a stack of rental applications on his desk. He thumbed through them with practiced ease, scanning each one with the precision of a seasoned businessman. Some applications were immediately dismissed. He could spot the wrong applicants from a mile away. Whether it was their lack of professional references, their less-than-ideal credit scores, or their backgrounds, Mr. Harris didn't hesitate to toss them aside. The people he rented to had to be just right. Neat, successful, refined. "I don't let just anyone into Harris Estates," he muttered to himself, a firm sense of conviction in his voice. "It's about maintaining the value. It's about quality." As he continued flipping through the applications, one particular form caught his attention. He paused, his fingers hovering over the paper as he read the name. Thompson. He frowned slightly, instinctively feeling the weight of the name as if something didn't sit right with him. He scanned the rest of the form, noting the addresses, the job history, and the family members listed. Everything appeared in order, even impressive in some areas. But that name, Thompson, was enough to trigger a knee-jerk reaction. Without further hesitation, Mr. Harris tossed the application into the rejection pile, dismissing it outright. "No," he muttered, his mind made up. "Can't have that family here." A twinge of guilt pricked at his conscience, but he quickly shoved it aside. "I'm just protecting my investment," he reasoned. "This is about what's best for the community. This is what my tenants want. They wouldn't be happy with people like them." He shook his head, pushing the thought away as he moved on to the next application. In his mind, the decision was simple. The Thompsons were a black family, and as far as Mr. Harris was concerned, their presence would disrupt the delicate balance he had cultivated in his neighborhood. It wasn't about race, he told himself. It was about preserving the high standards of his community. The neighborhood had always been a place for the affluent, for the people who had earned their place. He couldn't afford to compromise that for anyone. He leaned back in his leather chair, his thoughts swirling in quiet justification. "I built this neighborhood. I made it what it is. I have the right to choose who lives here," he muttered firmly, as if trying to convince an invisible audience. His mind wandered to the long history of his success. He had come from nothing, a modest background, a working-class upbringing, but through hard work, determination, and perhaps a little luck, he had clawed his way to the top. His reputation in the business world was impeccable, and he had carefully cultivated a persona of exclusivity. Only the best lived in Harris Estates. That's how it had always been, and that's how it would remain. But as Mr. Harris continued to rifle through the rental applications, something unsettled him. An unfamiliar thought gnawed at the back of his mind. Was he being too harsh? Was he being too narrow-minded? He quickly dismissed the thought as foolish. No, this was how business worked. This was how the world worked. He had built his empire on these very principles. Who was he to change now? He tried to push the discomfort aside and focus on the task at hand. The next application was a welcome site, one that would undoubtedly meet his standards, a well-to-do young couple, both with impressive professional backgrounds. Perfect. He carefully placed the application in the approved pile and moved on. But as the hours passed and he continued sifting through more applications, a quiet unease settled over him. The rejection of the Thompsons seemed more and more like a decision he couldn't quite explain, despite his firm convictions. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, his prejudices were a little more deeply ingrained than he had ever allowed himself to acknowledge. In the quiet solitude of his office, the weight of his own choices began to feel heavier, but he refused to entertain the thought further. The stacks of papers on his desk, the well-tended lawns outside his window, the pristine homes, they were all the evidence he needed that his way of thinking was the right way. This is how it's supposed to be, he told himself, reaffirming his stance once more. But little did he know, the decisions he made today were setting into motion a chain of events that would soon force him to confront everything he thought he knew about himself, his community, and the rules he had spent a lifetime building. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his world would soon come crashing down in ways he could never have predicted. And the Thompsons, they were not going to be the last family Mr. Harris would ever have to reject. The Thompson family's dream. The Thompson family gathered around their kitchen table, the warmth of their modest home filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter. The kitchen, though not as grand as the polished spaces Mr. Harris maintained in his upscale properties, was a place of love and comfort. Robert and Lisa sat side by side, their 4 boys, Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb, sitting eagerly at the table. There was excitement in the air, a spark that had been missing from their lives for some time. "We did it," Robert exclaimed, his eyes gleaming as he waved a letter in the air. The family had spent months searching for the perfect place to move, somewhere that could offer a fresh start, a chance for their children to grow in an environment that provided opportunity and safety. They had finally found what they thought was the perfect home, a spacious house in an up-and-coming neighborhood just outside the city. It seemed like everything had fallen into place. Lisa beamed with pride as she read the letter aloud, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. "It's official. We've been approved for the house on Ashbrook Drive. It's ours." The boys erupted into cheers, the sounds of excitement echoing throughout the room. Ethan, the eldest, stood up and clapped his hands. Noah jumped out of his seat, nearly knocking over his glass of juice. Jacob and Caleb, the youngest, scrambled to high-five each other, their small hands barely reaching each other in the frenzy. For Robert and Lisa, the news was more than just a new house. It was a dream they had worked for, fought for. After years of renting cramped apartments in neighborhoods where they were always reminded of their place in society, this was their chance to give their children something better, something lasting. They had put in the effort, saved every penny, and made countless sacrifices to make this moment happen. "We're going to make this house a home," Robert said with resolve, his hand resting on the table as he looked at his wife, their eyes locking in a moment of shared triumph. He could already see it, his children growing up in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets, schools that would offer them more than just the bare minimum, and neighbors who took pride in their community. It was a fresh start. Lisa wiped a tear from her eye and hugged Robert. "I knew we could do it. We've come so far." But the celebration was short-lived. That evening, Lisa sat down to read over the final details of the leasing agreement she had been sent. A small frown tugged at her lips as she noticed a small line of text at the bottom of the letter. "Please allow 30 days for processing. Final confirmation upon application review. She had already sent in the application weeks ago, and the house had seemed to be theirs. Why the delay? She picked up the phone to call the leasing office, but before she could dial, a letter arrived, postmarked from the property management company that oversaw the neighborhood. Her heart sank as she opened it. The words were cold, mechanical. Asterisk, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, we regret to inform you that your application for the property located at 119 Ashbrook Drive has been declined. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with other applicants who better align with the current standards of the community. Asterisk. The rejection felt like a punch to the gut. Lisa read the letter again, hoping it was some sort of mistake, but the words remained the same. There was no explanation, no reasoning, just a harsh finality to it. She looked at Robert, who had come over when he saw her face fall. What is it? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Lisa handed him the letter, her hand trembling. Robert's jaw clenched as he read it. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. I thought we were all set. They can't just. I don't understand, Lisa whispered, her voice choked with emotion. We were perfect tenants. We've worked so hard for this, Robert. We don't deserve this. Robert stood there for a moment, staring at the letter as if it might change in front of his eyes. No, this isn't right. I'm going to call them tomorrow. I'll get to the bottom of this. But deep down, he knew it was no use. He had seen this before. The barriers that existed, even when people tried to do everything the right way. The next morning, Robert picked up the phone and called the leasing office. He asked to speak directly with the property manager. When the call was answered, he explained the situation, his voice calm but firm. I don't understand, he said. We've been renting for years, we've always paid on time, and we're looking for a better opportunity for our children. Why was our application rejected? Was there an issue with our background check? The person on the other end hesitated, and then the words came, almost as if they had been rehearsed. Mr. Thompson, we do apologize for the inconvenience, but after reviewing your application, we've decided that, unfortunately, your family does not meet the current criteria for residency at this time. That's it? Robert asked, his voice rising in frustration. That's the reason. Does not meet criteria. What does that even mean? There was a long pause. I'm afraid I can't provide more details at this time. The decision is final. Robert slammed the phone down in frustration. He could feel the anger building inside him, a hot flush of injustice rising in his chest. The rejection wasn't just personal, it was systematic. It wasn't about their credit or rental history, it was about something more fundamental. And though it pained him to admit it, he knew what that something was. Lisa, overhearing the conversation, sat down on the couch, her face pale. It's because of the color of our skin, isn't it? She asked quietly, her voice breaking. Robert nodded slowly, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. It was something they had dealt with time and again, but this felt different. This wasn't just a rejection, it was a message. It was a barrier meant to keep them out, to remind them that no matter how hard they worked, some doors would always remain closed to them. I won't stand for it, Robert said firmly. I'm not letting them get away with this. Lisa looked at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. What are we going to do, Robert? How do we fix this? We fight, he said with quiet resolve. We don't let this go. I'm going to find out who is behind this, and I'm going to hold them accountable. This isn't over. But as Robert prepared for what he knew would be an uphill battle, something else weighed heavily on his mind. In the midst of the pain and frustration, an unexpected twist in his family's history had begun to surface. It was a conversation Robert had never had with his parents, a truth his father had kept hidden, one that would soon reveal an undeniable connection to the very person responsible for his family's rejection, Gregory Harris. And with that revelation, everything would change. Unraveling the truth. The days following the rejection were filled with an unsettled tension. The Thompsons had hoped that, once they took action, the property management company would have a change of heart. They were, after all, just a hard-working family looking for a chance to improve their lives. But the longer Robert and Lisa sat with the pain of that rejection, the more certain they became that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, deeply ingrained system, a system that stood in the way of their progress, no matter how hard they tried to break through. Robert had made calls to other potential landlords, but each time he hit a wall. No matter what approach he took, the answers were the same. "Sorry, we've already chosen someone else." The politeness in their voices couldn't hide the undertone of finality. It wasn't just that the doors were being closed, they were being locked and bolted shut. Meanwhile, Lisa spent her days researching Harris Estates, looking into every detail of the property and the people behind it. She had heard of Gregory Harris, of course. Everyone in the city had. He was the face of success in the real estate world, a man who had built an empire out of nothing. But as Lisa dug deeper, she realized there was something more to him than just the glossy facade of his achievements. Lisa's fingers trembled as she scrolled through an old news article from years ago. It was a piece about Harris Estates in its early days, back when the neighborhood had first been developed. In one of the photographs, a much younger Gregory Harris stood beside a man she recognized, Robert's father. The image was grainy, a relic of the past, but the resemblance between Robert and the man in the photo was unmistakable. It was Robert's father, David Thompson, standing shoulder to shoulder with Gregory Harris. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. She had always known there were parts of Robert's family history that were shrouded in mystery. Robert had never spoken much about his parents' past, especially his father. There were whispers that David Thompson had once been involved in business dealings with prominent people, but the details were vague and shrouded in secrecy. "Robert," Lisa called from the living room, her voice thick with emotion. "You need to see this." Robert walked in, a frown on his face. The frustration of the past few days had started to weigh on him. He was tired, and the thought of calling yet another property manager to face more rejection seemed unbearable. But Lisa's voice was different this time, urgent, almost frantic. When he saw the picture on her phone, his breath caught. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. "That's my father," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't know. I never knew he had any connections with Gregory Harris." Lisa turned to him, her face pale. "How could you not know? This is big, Robert. This is something that we need to understand. Your father and Harris were together in that picture. They were partners, weren't they?" Robert's mind raced. He had always known that his father had been involved in business dealings, but there were so many gaps in the story, so many unanswered questions. David Thompson had never been one to discuss the past, especially not with Robert. His father's world had always seemed distant, separate from the reality Robert and Lisa had built together. But this image, this shocking discovery, changed everything. "I don't know what this means, Lisa," Robert said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I didn't even know my father and Harris were ever close. He never talked about him. He barely even talked about work. But I do remember. He used to get these calls late at night, mysterious ones. I always wondered who they were from, but he'd just hang up and go back to whatever he was doing." Lisa sat down, her mind racing as well. "Do you think your father had something to do with all of this? Maybe he's the reason you were rejected from Harris Estates." Robert shook his head. "No, I can't believe that. I mean, my father was many things. He had his secrets, that's for sure. But I can't see him doing something like this." But as Robert sat back, trying to reconcile the fragments of his past with the painful reality of the present, something else gnawed at him, something deeper. It was no secret that Gregory Harris had built his empire on a foundation of exclusivity, of keeping certain people out while letting others in. But what if his father had been part of that system? What if the connection between David Thompson and Gregory Harris wasn't just business, but something more personal, something tied to the very reasons Robert's family had been rejected. The more Robert thought about it, the more he realized he had to dig deeper. He couldn't just sit back and accept the rejection without knowing the full story. He had to confront the past, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths. His family's future depended on it. The next morning, Robert set out on a mission. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. He drove to his father's old house, a modest home in a quiet part of town that had long since been abandoned after David's passing. Robert had avoided it for years, unwilling to confront the silence that lingered in the air. But today, he needed to find something, anything, that could help him make sense of the situation. The house was exactly as he remembered it, old with faded paint and cracked windows, but still standing strong. Robert unlocked the door and stepped inside, the musty smell of forgotten memories hitting him immediately. The walls, once filled with family photos and keepsakes, were bare now. He moved through the rooms methodically, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. It didn't take long before Robert found it, the old leather-bound folder hidden in the back of his father's study, tucked away in a drawer that had never been opened. With trembling hands, he flipped through it. There, in the middle of the folder, was a collection of old papers, deeds, contracts, and letters. His eyes skimmed over the documents until one caught his attention, an old business contract signed by David Thompson and Gregory Harris. The contract was dated over 2 decades ago. As Robert read the fine print, his heart sank. The document was a partnership agreement between his father and Harris. It was more than just a business deal. It was an agreement to create an exclusive neighborhood, a place for the city's elite to live, free from outsiders. The contract outlined the terms for land purchases, property developments, and even the specific demographic the neighborhood was intended to attract. Robert's stomach churned as he read the chilling line. Only individuals of a certain financial and social status are eligible for residency. It was then that Robert understood the full scope of the system that had been set in motion, a system built on exclusion, on keeping certain people out while others were allowed to flourish. His father had been part of that system, unknowingly perpetuating it in ways he had never truly understood. The truth was clear now. The rejection of the Thompsons wasn't just about their credit or their background. It was about something much more insidious, about the very foundation of Gregory Harris's empire. And now it was up to Robert to confront it, to break free from the past his father had left behind, and change the future for his family. But he couldn't do it alone. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but one thing was certain. He would stop at nothing to make sure his family, and others like them, had a place in a world that had always tried to keep them out. A battle for justice. The discovery of the contract had sent Robert reeling. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet, his entire understanding of his family's legacy turned upside down. His father's role in perpetuating a system that kept people like the Thompsons locked out of opportunity was a bitter pill to swallow. But there was no turning back now. Robert couldn't pretend that he didn't know the truth. He couldn't look at his sons and tell them that everything would be fine, not when this injustice was staring him in the face. The weight of it all pressed down on him as he sat at his kitchen table, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the business contract. The air was thick with the heaviness of his thoughts. He had spent so many years trying to build a future for his family, hoping that if he worked hard enough, if he played by the rules, that he and his children would have the opportunities that others took for granted. But now he understood that those opportunities weren't available to everyone. Not by a long shot. Not when men like Gregory Harris control the rules of the game. "I can't believe this," Robert muttered to himself. He hadn't spoken to Lisa yet about the contract, not wanting to upset her further, but he knew he had to. She deserved to know what he had found. They had to face this together, just as they had faced every challenge before. She needed to understand the depth of what they were up against. But even as Robert knew that the truth had to be confronted, he couldn't help but feel a rising sense of urgency. He knew he couldn't wait any longer to take action. Every day they delayed was another day spent trapped in the very system that was keeping his family from a better life. The phone rang. interrupting his thoughts. It was Lisa. "Robert," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "I've been talking to some people, trying to find out more about Harris Estates, and I think I've found something. Something that could help us." His heart skipped a beat. "What is it? What have you found?" "I've been looking into the history of the property, specifically the land it was built on," Lisa explained. "There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of legal jargon, but there's one thing that stands out. It's a land use agreement from the city. Apparently, when the neighborhood was first developed, there were zoning laws that were supposed to ensure the property was open to all families, not just a select few. But those laws were never properly enforced. There are loopholes in the system, Robert, and I think we can use them." Robert's mind raced. "Wait, are you saying the whole thing is illegal?" "I'm not sure," Lisa replied. "But if there are loopholes, there's a chance we could challenge it in court. We could fight back against Harris Estates' exclusionary policies and force them to open up to families like ours. But we need to act fast. This is our shot." Robert stood up, pacing around the room. The idea was both exhilarating and terrifying. It wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about breaking down the barriers that had kept so many people from having access to the same opportunities as others. If they could win this battle, they wouldn't just change their own future. They could change the future for countless families who had been kept in the shadows for far too long. "We can't waste any more time," Robert said, determination seeping into his voice. "Let's do it. Let's fight this." Lisa let out a breath of relief. "I knew you'd say that." The next few days were a blur of research, phone calls, and meetings. Robert and Lisa pulled in every resource they could find. Lawyers, community activists, and even former tenants who had lived in the neighborhood before it was exclusively gated. They needed to gather as much information as possible to build a case. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Gregory Harris's empire was built on a house of cards. But those cards had been carefully stacked, and tearing them down would require more than just passion. It would require strategy, patience, and persistence. On one of those long, grueling days, Robert found himself standing in the middle of an old community center in a neighborhood far removed from the glossy streets of Harris Estates. The area had once been thriving, but over time, it had become forgotten, neglected by the city, abandoned by the powers that be. It was a place that had suffered from the same discrimination, the same systemic inequality that had kept the Thompsons from accessing the very community that had once been promised to them. He had come here to meet a man named Terrence, a former tenant of Harris Estates, who had been one of the first families to be forced out of the neighborhood under the guise of upgrading the community. Terrence had spent years fighting for the rights of displaced families, and now, with Robert's newfound determination, he had agreed to lend his knowledge to the cause. Terrence was waiting for him at the community center, sitting at a table in the back corner, his worn jacket hanging loosely on his frame. His eyes were sharp, though, and they studied Robert as he approached. There was no sign of warmth in his expression, but there was a depth of experience there that Robert couldn't ignore. "I'm guessing you're the one with the fight in your eyes," Terrence said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Robert nodded. "I need your help. I need to know everything about Harris Estates. What happened when the neighborhood was first built, who was involved, and any way we can use the law to fight back." Terrence chuckled dryly. "You don't ask for much, do you? All right, I'll tell you what I know. But know this, Harris is a slippery one. He's been at this game for decades. It's not just about owning property, it's about owning power. And he doesn't give it up easily." "I'm not here to play games," Robert said, his voice steady. "I'm here to win." For the next several hours, Terrence laid out a history that was both horrifying and eye-opening. He spoke of the early days of Harris Estates, about how the neighborhood had been marketed as a place for the city's elite, places where only certain people could afford to live, and even then, only if they fit a very specific mold. He explained how the zoning laws had been manipulated to avoid any enforcement of affordable housing requirements. But more than that, He shared stories of families who had been pushed out of their homes under the pretense of community development, their lives uprooted, their futures uncertain. The more Robert learned, the more infuriated he became. It wasn't just the Thompsons who had suffered. It was dozens, maybe hundreds of families whose lives had been disrupted by Harris's actions. This wasn't about one man or one family. This was about a system that had kept people like them in a perpetual cycle of poverty and exclusion. And now, Robert understood that the fight he was embarking on wasn't just for his family. It was for all of them. "You're not just fighting for a house," Terrence said, his tone shifting. "You're fighting for a future. You're fighting for the people who came before you and the ones who'll come after you. You think you're up against Harris. You're up against a whole system. But if you're willing to stand your ground, we can tear it down." Robert clenched his fists, a fire igniting in his chest. "I'm ready," he said, his voice low but full of purpose. "We'll do whatever it takes." As Robert left the community center, the weight of the battle ahead felt more real than ever. But for the first time in days, he wasn't afraid. He was armed with knowledge, with determination, and with the unwavering belief that his family deserved more. And if he had to take on the entire system to get it, he would. The fight for justice had just begun. The courtroom confrontation. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Robert and Lisa, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose, worked tirelessly to build their case against Gregory Harris and Harris Estates. They had no illusions about the difficulty of the fight ahead. Harris was a powerful man, deeply entrenched in the city's elite circles. But Robert's conviction only grew stronger with each passing day. He couldn't ignore the injustice any longer, not when it was affecting his family, and not when it was keeping so many others in the shadows. Their legal team had worked through mountains of documents, zoning codes, property agreements, and land use records. They discovered that the loopholes in Harris Estates development were not just technicalities. They were systemic flaws that allowed for the exclusion of entire communities. Lisa had been the one to pore through old city council meeting minutes, finding evidence of selective zoning and regulations that had been conveniently ignored when it came to the development of Harris Estates. It was clear that there had been a deliberate effort to restrict the neighborhood to a select, homogeneous group of residents. The city had turned a blind eye to the discriminatory policies, and Harris had capitalized on that, constructing an empire based on exclusion. But Robert wasn't content with just gathering evidence. He knew that they needed to take this fight to the heart of the system, the courtroom. With the support of their legal team and the testimony of others who had been wronged by Harris, they filed a lawsuit against him and the city. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The day of the trial arrived with an electric tension in the air. The courthouse steps were filled with reporters, activists, and members of the community. Robert and Lisa walked side by side, their faces determined, yet filled with the quiet anxiety that comes before a battle. This was it, the moment that would define their future, and potentially, the future of many others who had been denied the opportunity to live in a community that should have been open to all. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. On one side, Robert and Lisa sat, flanked by their legal team and a few supporters. On the other side, Gregory Harris and his legal team, dressed in immaculate suits, sat with an air of cold confidence. Harris himself was calm, his eyes sharp, and his posture rigid. He looked every bit the part of the powerful, untouchable man he had spent decades constructing himself to be. His entire life had been built on the idea that people like Robert and Lisa didn't belong in neighborhoods like his. But today, that narrative was being questioned. The trial began with opening statements. Robert's lawyer, a seasoned litigator named Valerie Thompson, stood confidently before the judge, her voice steady but full of conviction. "Your Honor," Valerie began, "today we are here not just to seek justice for the Thompsons, but to right a systemic wrong. The development of Harris Estates and the practices of Mr. Gregory Harris have systematically excluded families based on their race and economic status. The zoning laws that were meant to ensure fairness and equality were ignored, and the city turned a blind eye to these discriminatory practices. This case is not just about one family. It is about holding those in power accountable and ensuring that future generations do not have to fight the same battle. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, Robert could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment when they would either make history or fall to the weight of the system. But he knew that they had to fight. They had to push through, no matter how difficult it was. Harris's lawyer, a slick and smooth-talking man named Adam Foster, stood up to give his opening statement. His words were polished, designed to evoke sympathy for Harris's so-called vision of the neighborhood, a place for families of a certain caliber to call home. He painted Harris as a visionary businessman, someone who had spent decades building a community that would maintain its high standards and value. Mr. Harris's work has transformed this city, Foster began, his voice oozing charm. He has provided jobs, built homes, and created a thriving community. The rules and regulations surrounding zoning are complex, and Mr. Harris has followed the law to the letter. This case is not about discrimination. It is about ensuring that the values of the community are upheld, and those values are about quality, not race or income. Robert clenched his jaw, the words gnawing at him. He had heard it all before. The justification of exclusion in the name of maintaining standards. It wasn't just a defense of a real estate empire. It was a defense of the very ideology that had kept his family out. But they had the truth on their side. They had evidence, and they had people willing to speak out. The first witness called by the prosecution was Terrence, the former tenant who had been forced out of Harris Estates years ago. His testimony was powerful, raw, and emotional. He spoke about the discrimination he and his family had faced when they lived in the neighborhood. He described how they were pressured to leave when the neighborhood was upgraded, how they were told that their presence was detracting from the image Harris wanted to project. Terrence's voice trembled as he recounted the pain of losing his home, of having to move his family to a lesser part of town because they were told they didn't belong in a place like Harris Estates. Mr. Harris and his team made it clear that families like mine weren't welcome, Terrence said, his voice thick with emotion. They didn't care about our struggles, our dreams. All they cared about was keeping their neighborhood exclusive, keeping people like us out. And that's what they've been doing for years. The courtroom was silent as Terrence's words sank in. Even the judge, who had seemed reserved at the beginning, appeared moved by his testimony. Next, Robert took the stand. He was nervous, but there was no turning back now. He knew that this was his moment to speak out, not just for his family, but for all the families who had been denied a place in the community they deserved. "I never thought this would be my fight," Robert began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had been through. "I never thought that in this country I'd have to fight for something as basic as a home for my family. We're just like anyone else. We work hard, we pay our taxes, we contribute to our community. But because of people like Gregory Harris, we've been excluded, told we didn't belong, that we weren't good enough." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "I found out that my father was part of this system, a system that has kept people like me out of opportunities that others take for granted. And now, I'm here to say that it's time for that to stop. It's time for families like mine to have a place in a neighborhood like Harris Estates. We've earned it, just like anyone else." The room was still. There were no objections from the defense, no interruptions. For the first time in years, Robert felt like his voice was being heard, like he was fighting not just for his own family, but for something much larger than that. This was about changing the rules, about challenging the systems that kept so many people from reaching their potential. The defense's cross-examination was relentless. Foster tried to paint Robert's testimony as emotional and biased, attempting to undermine the strength of his words. But Robert stood firm, refusing to let Harris and his team manipulate the truth. Every question, every accusation, he answered with dignity. He wasn't going to let them control the narrative any longer. As the trial progressed, more and more people came forward to testify. former residents, city officials, and even experts on zoning laws who confirmed the systemic flaws in the development of Harris Estates. Each witness added weight to the growing case against Gregory Harris. Robert's belief in their cause deepened, and even in the face of relentless opposition, he remained resolute. The final day of the trial came, and the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. The defense presented its closing argument, trying to cast doubt on the credibility of the Thompsons' case. They argued that the zoning laws were not as clear-cut as the prosecution had made them out to be, and that Harris had done nothing wrong. But the damage had been done. The evidence, the testimonies, and the undeniable truth of Robert's words had left an indelible mark. The case was no longer just about one family. It was about justice, equality, and holding the powerful accountable. As the judge called for a recess, Robert could feel the weight of the moment. Whatever the outcome, this battle had changed him. He had found his voice. He had found his purpose. And as the court awaited the judge's final decision, Robert knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened, they had already won something far more important than a court ruling. They had shown the world that they would no longer be silenced. They would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. A new beginning. The final day of the trial had arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Robert sat in the same seat he had occupied for the past few weeks, his fingers tightly gripping the edge of the table. Lisa was by his side, her face a mask of calm determination. They had fought this battle with everything they had, and now it was out of their hands. The jury had deliberated for hours, their fate inextricably tied to the outcome of this case. Would they see the injustice for what it was, or would the entrenched system of privilege and exclusion win once more? Gregory Harris, on the other side of the courtroom, exuded the quiet confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. His legal team had presented a polished defense, but Robert knew that the truth was on their side. It was the truth of the community that had been overlooked for years, the truth of families like his, who had been pushed out in favor of the rich and powerful. He had poured everything into this fight, every ounce of energy, every shred of dignity, every sleepless night. Now there was nothing left to do but wait. The room fell silent as the judge returned to the bench, signaling that the jury had reached a verdict. Robert's heart raced in his chest. He had been through so much to get here: the legal battles, the personal revelations, the memories of his father's role in perpetuating these practices. Now the moment of truth was finally upon them. The judge addressed the room, her voice steady and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the verdict in the case of Robert Thompson versus Harris Estates. Please rise." The room complied, every person holding their breath as the clerk handed the judge the paper with the jury's decision. The silence felt suffocating, as though time itself had come to a standstill. The judge looked over the document, then turned her gaze to the courtroom. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Robert Thompson. The practices of Harris Estates, as outlined in this case, are deemed to be in violation of zoning laws and discriminatory in nature. We order that Harris Estates cease its exclusionary practices immediately and take steps to ensure equal access to all families, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. Further, the defendant, Gregory Harris, is ordered to pay restitution to those who have been wrongfully displaced and denied housing." A wave of emotion surged through Robert as the words hit him. He couldn't believe it. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. The weight that had been pressing down on his chest for so long lifted, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of lightness. Lisa's hand squeezed his, her eyes filled with tears of relief and joy. Robert stood, his knees unsteady, but his heart soaring. It wasn't just a victory for his family. It was a victory for everyone who had been pushed aside, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. It was a turning point in the fight against systemic inequality. They had shattered the facade that had protected people like Gregory Harris for so long, and they had proven that justice could prevail, no matter how powerful the opposition. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some of disbelief, some of triumph. Reporters scrambled to get statements, their cameras flashing in a blur of motion. But for Robert and Lisa, the noise faded into the background as they locked eyes with each other. They had done it. They had fought for their family, for their future, and for every family that had been unjustly excluded from a place they should have been able to call home. Gregory Harris, for the first time during the entire trial, looked shaken. His face, typically so composed, now showed cracks of disbelief. His legal team huddled around him, whispering in urgent tones, but he was lost in thought, his gaze distant. For the first time, it seemed as though the power he had wielded so effortlessly was slipping away. The gavel came down, and the judge addressed the courtroom. This case is adjourned. The court's decision is final. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. It was as if a new dawn was breaking, one filled with possibilities that hadn't existed before. Robert, Lisa, and their legal team stepped into the sunlight, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and elation. But even as the world around them seemed to celebrate their victory, Robert knew that the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning. They had won the case, but there was still much work to be done. Harris Estates would appeal, of course. The system they had just torn down would not give up without a fight. But they had made their point. They had shown that change was possible, that people could stand up to the powerful and win. The weeks following the trial were filled with challenges, but also with hope. Harris Estates did, indeed, appeal the court's decision, but Robert and his team were ready for it. The legal battle continued, but now there was momentum. They had made history, and the city, once silent on the issue of exclusion, was beginning to take notice. Gregory Harris, however, was not prepared for the backlash that followed the trial. His reputation, built on years of exclusivity and privilege, began to unravel. News outlets across the city, and even the state, picked up the story. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Harris found himself at the center of a scandal that exposed not just his discriminatory practices, but also the way in which he had used his wealth and influence to maintain control over communities. For years, he had enjoyed the privilege of being untouchable, but now, the walls were closing in on him. For Robert, though, the most significant changes came at home. His family had been through so much. They had endured the trials of their exclusion, the hardships that had come with being denied a place in a better community. But now, they could look toward the future with hope. The neighborhood that had once been out of reach was now open to them. Robert began looking for a home, a real home for his family, a place where his children could grow up without the shadow of exclusion hanging over them. The Thompsons had a future now, one filled with opportunity, one that had been hard-won. And it wasn't just about the Thompsons. Their victory had sparked a larger movement, one that resonated with communities across the city and beyond. Families who had been denied access to housing, to opportunity, began to speak out, inspired by Robert's courage. Activists and legal experts came together to continue challenging exclusionary practices, pushing for reforms that would ensure equality for all. One afternoon, as Robert sat with Lisa in their new living room, finally, after years of struggle, he reflected on everything they had been through. He thought about how far they had come, how much they had fought for, and how much they had lost and gained along the way. But most of all, he thought about his children, his sons, who would grow up in a world where they would no longer have to question their worth, where they could thrive without being told they didn't belong. The weight of everything that had happened, the pain and the sacrifices, felt distant now. The future was bright, and Robert knew that the fight they had fought would echo through the generations to come. They had opened a door that had been slammed shut for too long. And now families like theirs had a place in the world, a place where they belonged. Lisa sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. Together, they had changed the course of their future. Together, they had won a victory not just for themselves, but for every family that had been denied a home, a place to belong, and the chance to dream. As the sun began to set outside their window, Robert knew that this was only the beginning. They had won the battle. But now, it was time to build a world where justice, equality, and opportunity weren't just dreams. They were a reality.